Hello, my name is Khanya Mashabela. I am a curator at Norval Foundation. I'd like to introduce you to this exhibition, this group show named I Have Made a Place. This exhibition is a mix of modern and contemporary works by artists in the Homestead collection, which is based at Norval Foundation, as well as Sharon Art Collection. And in this exhibition, you will see works that help to show how artists situate their identity through the kind of placemaking that they produce within their works, whether that's in the domestic space or a rural landscape or an imagined space. Introducing the exhibition with this first work by Kate Godkins, we have this work titled Another Debt. In this work, you can see this kind of suburban space washed over in pink. There's kind of an implication that the other debt referred to in the title is this pink pool that contrasts from the rest of the work. And then there's this feeling of kind of malaise that you get with this kind of pink washing over and haziness of the work. I'd like to think of this work as a kind of subtle critique of the capitalistic version of making a place for oneself. So through kind of ownership and indebtedness. Let's keep moving throughout the show. So here we have a work by Khanya. It is actually the title work of the exhibition. So the title is borrowed from this wonderful work called I Have Made a Place. It is essentially an abstract work, although Khanya works on the kind of cusp between abstraction and figuration. So you can kind of see that there is this very chaotic, looping, bright orange lines in the side of this frame. And I'd like to think about it as a kind of an analogy or kind of visual metaphor about making a place for oneself, this kind of busyness inside of a kind of uniform frame that contains all of the chaos happening internally. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about how art can contain this idea of finding the self and identity making. So along the wall again, we have this work by Billy Zangewa. And this work is essentially an image of Henri Vaughan, who is an incredible art dealer. He passed away last year during the pandemic. The work is titled Free Spirit, and it's Billy Zangewa's imagination of what the afterlife might look like for Henri. And there's almost this void-like space that we see with these fluffy, beautiful pink clouds. And then, of course, the work is kind of rooted into this context and rooted into specificity when we see that Billy's own work is kind of hanging in the background of this heaven space. So this idea that there's kind of still art in heaven, this imagined kind of restful afterlife that she's created for her friend. So we go back to the domestic with this work by Ian Gross. And this one is called Lux Nova. So that means kind of new light in Latin. You can see that it's actually just kind of a series of painterly strokes creating these shapes. But of course, it's a kind of crack of light showing over a corner of a room. And it's a very evocative work. You imagine kind of looking intently at the way that the light is falling into our own space. And it feels kind of cozy and comfortable when we think about this very insular kind of internal space. And along with the work next to it, which also shows the domestic space, we see this work by Deborah Poynton called Interior with a Red Tub. And like with Ian Gross, we see this very kind of comfortable space that the artist has made for the subject. You can see in the corner that there's a wedding dress. So perhaps this is a kind of honeymoon holiday homemaking between a couple. There's a nude figure in the shadows. And there's this feeling of being both outside and inside. And I think that this is partly the idea of making a home, the idea of being in a space that is insular but also not stifling. And that's kind of the placemaking that I think we're most familiar with. So the exhibition kind of turns back into abstraction with this work by Kamangwale Hilaire. It is an installation made up of grass, suitcases, porcelain dogs, all found materials, as well as little sculptures made out of school desks, platforms made out of blackboards. And part of the idea behind the work is that it's kind of an ode to Nat Nakasa. The work is called Reddening of the Greens, or the Dog Manifestos. And Nat Nakasa was a famed South African journalist during apartheid, and he was forced to go into exile to America, spent some time in Harvard and New York, but ultimately he fell from a building in what looked like a suicide. And the idea is that this work is this kind of taking home of his remains. Kamang had done a private performance at Nat Nakasa's grave in upstate New York, and a few months later, the work, his grave was taken and brought to South Africa. So this idea of exile and displacement, as well as a very literal reference to land and soil and kind of agriculture, this language of kind of suburban lawn and this very domestic dog, that's quite nostalgic image. So there's many layers that this work is operating on, but it's a very evocative piece. We of course have the broken dog in the center. As we move past this installation, which takes quite a big chunk of the room and divides the room between this kind of next section, we see this work by Bronwyn Katz, a very early work. Bronwyn made the work when, in the final year of her undergraduate studies. And in this work, you see the artist in 3 different kind of situations. The first is that she is washing her feet with the soil of her hometown in Kimberley, a suburb called Groenpunt. And then kind of doing this dance and then playing a game that was from her childhood. So basically evoking the space of home while away from home. So again, there's the sense of feeling kind of displaced and nostalgic for our hometown. And then there's also, the work is called Herinnering, which translates to soil memory or soil monument. So this is the idea of creating a monument with soil, but also kind of acknowledging and asserting the fact that her small hometown deserves to be memorialized and remembered in the cultural memory. So it's basically invoking and using gestures to make a new kind of monument. So now behind me you can see a work by Masheko Langa, quite an early work from 2002. It's untitled, Red Mountain. And you can see the Red Mountain kind of looming in the middle of the work with these kind of plains and washes of color. And in that you can see this very luxe, very verdant rural landscape. Masheko Langa has been very interested in thinking about his hometown in Limpopo, in Bakenburg. So it's kind of a making of place through memory. When I look at the work, I think of some bits of a person who's kind of trying to remember a place that was kind of not seen in a very long time, trying to kind of remap that space. And then behind me, we have, of course, Igshan Adams with this large textile work. It's an incredible piece, very detailed. And of course, you can also see the ridges of the material that's been kind of ruched up to form these elevations and depressions. and then you can see the very kind of mixed different kind of materials that are used to make all of these different colors. And it is evocative of looking at a landscape from a bird's eye view. The work is suitably called Eitzig, which means outlook. So it's kind of this new perspective on the land, looking at it from above. These are kind of new takes on landscape that Igshan was doing, were partly kind of connected to his beliefs in Sufism. And in Islam, there's this idea of kind of, or Sufi Islam rather, this idea of kind of meditative kind of making in order to create harmony and peace and tranquility, which I think you feel as you look at the work. Here we have this wonderful kind of early Peter Clark work. It is called Ruin Teslasal in the Cape Province. And you can see that there is, of course, a ruin, a kind of ruined house. And then in front of it, a disabled person who seems to have lost their leg and is walking on crutches. And I think this is quite an ambiguous work. Of course, you've got this damaged body and this damaged home behind it, but there's also kind of a sense of optimism. When you look at these bright colors and the solidity of that body and the solidity of the house, there's this kind of contrasting optimism, as if you were saying, they're still standing. And I think you can feel this optimism and this bright color and the dynamism of the painterly kind of brush strokes. It is quite an evocative work. And then finally, we end on these two works by Gladys Mnguglandlu. In a way, I kind of think of these works as being almost a counterpoint to the depiction of a suburb by Kate Godkins. So there we have a Nyanga landscape, and next to it we have suburbs with Table Mountain, which is a view of the kind of the central suburbs, the affluent suburbs. And I think this is the kind of contrast of the view of a suburb from the outsider's perspective, somebody who was not allowed to live in these spaces, as well as the idea of a less affluent space that exists on the outskirts of the city because of kind of apartheid spatial planning. What's also interesting about these works is that while the houses on this mountainside almost look like kind of dotted kind of wildflowers in a landscape, the homes in Nyanga, while kind of chaotic and collapsing and falling upon each other, there's also a row of people kind of moving their way through the landscape. And in contrast, it kind of gives you the sense that there is a sense of community that Mnguglandlu has. Even if the space is more arid, there is still kind of this connection to people that she might not have had in the suburbs, even though she had sold her work there. So thank you for joining me on this walkabout. We hope to be able to be open to the public soon so that you can see this show in person. We look forward to seeing you. Thank you.